Hope you're all staying healthy. Thank you for joining us today for National Review Institute's 1955 Society video call with National Review art critic Brian Allen. My name is Jason Wise, and I'm a Regional Development Officer for NRI based in my hometown of Seattle. We are pleased to bring you this discussion today as part of NRI's virus-free forums during this quarantine time. Bill Buckley created National Review as a magazine of both politics and culture. He knew how important culture was. As a part of our support for the NR mission and the preservation of the Buckley legacy, NRI directly underwrites the Books, Arts, and Manners section of the magazine. Many of you enjoy reading Jay Nordlinger on music or Ormond White on movies, for instance. We hope tomorrow you will join us for our next movie call with Kevin Williamson and Kyle Smith. They will be discussing civil disobedience in films with a focus on 1966, A Man for All Seasons, and 1982's Gandhi. Today we're going to talk about art, something particularly important to NRI President Lindsay Craig, who has an art background. Brian Allen was the director of the Museum Division of the New York Historical Society in the Addison Gallery in Andover, Massachusetts. He's an art historian and art critic for National Review, writing a weekly column as part of the Books, Arts, and Manners section. He's written for the magazine since May of 2017. Brian is actually in Dallas right now working on a story for the magazine, and he's close to the Meyerson Symphony Center, where we held our Buckley Prize Dinner back in 2015. For today's call, Brian will talk for about 10 minutes before we open it up for questions. If you are joining us online, you can ask a question using the chat, or better yet, Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also email me at jason@nrinstitute.org. With that, Brian, you have the floor.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to all the readers and the supporters of National Review. This is a big honor for me. Yes, I am in Dallas. I'm staying very close to the symphony and the opera house, which of course are dark now because of COVID-19, and they're struggling with the social distancing requirements that are going to go really to the heart of their financial model, the financial model of theater that's over 2,000 years old. It depends on a live audience. So I never imagined that I would be writing so many stories that touch even remotely on a health issue or a public policy issue, because in my writing, I almost never talk about politics or public policy at all. I talk about a museum show, exhibition, an art gallery, an upcoming artist. But my interest in COVID-19 really started as a personal one. In February, I was going to Europe for a whole group of NR stories. I was going to go to the big art fair, was planning to go to the big art fair in Maastricht, the TFAF fair, and I knew that coronavirus was on the horizon, and I wanted to make sure, for my safety, on behalf of my family, that I would be safe going over there. And I did research to satisfy myself. I talked to my doctor that with proper precautions it would be fine, and I took those, and it was fine. And I was over in the Netherlands and the UK. I think I was gone for 2 weeks. And I came back on March 15th. The situation in London then was anti-lockdown. The day before I came back, I went to the National Gallery. I went to the Tate, National Portrait Gallery. I wrote stories about all of these things. But almost immediately when I came back to the US, we had the lockdown, and for the first time in the history of the Western world, every museum, every art venue was shuttered, and that's never happened before. And it's become the biggest national story, I'm sure, for the year, but it's also, without doubt, the biggest art story, if for no other reason, is that every art museum, every dealer, for a period of many weeks, the art market was in suspension, and that has never happened before. So as it's unfolded, it's played out in many different ways for museums. And the one thing I would say is every museum is different. There's no one template financially for running a museum. Some museums, like the Addison, where I was director, the Clark Art Institute, where I was a curator for a long time, they have endowments, big savings accounts, and they live off the income of the endowments, and they do a little bit of fundraising, but they mostly live off of their investments. For most museums, though, it's a combination of, okay, they might have a small endowment that generates some income, but a lot of museums charge admission. And for some museums, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is the biggest museum in the country, probably the flagship for American museums, they are very heavily dependent on admissions income, shop income, restaurant income, and then you've got the whole panoply of wedding income, all of those different revenue sources that museums had built into their budgets for this year. And all of a sudden, in March 15th, March 20th, that all stopped. So the issue that I've been exploring is how they have been dealing with those shortfalls. And it's exposed a lot of fault lines in the museum world. I never thought the Art Museum Directors Association, which is the keeper of standards for the art museum business, would do two things I never thought that they would do. One is they will not sanction a museum if it uses acquisitions endowment, the income from acquisitions funds, for their operating budget. I never thought that would happen. And the other thing that has always been incendiary for art museums is the use of money from the sales of art for the operating budget. The golden rule is if you sell art from the collection, you have to use the money to buy more art. So it stays within that art envelope. And now the art museum directors are saying that they will not sanction a museum that sells art and uses the money for what they call collection care. And what I've written is that collection care basically is anything and everything. Almost every expenditure a museum makes has some relationship to the collection. A curator's salary could go towards collection care. But they've done this, and that shows how desperate financially the museum community feels. And of course, as I've written, that those two steps would not have been taken without the approval of the opinion makers in the museum community, which are the big museums, the Met, the Art Institute of Chicago, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Philadelphia Museum, the MFA, and Boston. So that has been a big issue. And it's, once you open the barn door on that, it's going to be very difficult to close it again. So the implications of those two rule changes are going to impact museums in very major ways for a number of years. Now, what I've written about in the last a few weeks, and I think this astonishes me, is a lot of museums are really dragging their feet about reopening. And in that sense, and I wrote about this for NR right at the beginning of the COVID-19 calamity, that museums are really well positioned to be right out there when the shutdown ends and opening up. Museums are, they're one of their specialties is crowd control. The guards are trained to tell people, don't stand too close to a painting. So it's just one step, don't stand too close to the person near you, a person in the same room. A museum can enforce social distancing by limiting the numbers of people who come in, the numbers of people per gallery. Most of the staff in a museum, they work back of house, and they don't have any day-to-day contact with the public. Every gallery in a museum has a camera so that the guards can see what's going on. So I felt it would be, of all the arts organizations, really easy for museums to reopen. But what I'm shocked to see is they've been dragging their feet. And personally, and I've said this a couple of times, I think a lot of museum directors and a lot of staff, they don't want to reopen. I don't know whether they're frightened to reopen, but I do feel that if the state says that it is safe for a museum to open, that they are obliged to reopen. A museum is not a private club. It's a not-for-profit for a reason. It serves the public. Now, we do have a situation in the country where a lot of people are afraid to go out. They're afraid to go to public spaces. And I think museums have an important role because it's so easy for them to reopen safely. They can put sneeze guards in front of the reception desks. They can put Purell dispensers. They could just open their permanent collection galleries. But I think for a period of time, we're going to have to re-educate people that it's safe to go out in public. That's the situation that we have right now. But a lot of them, they're taking their own sweet time. Now, I know museum time, I have said this a couple of times in my articles, museum time is like biblical time. It's like geological time, where making a decision that anybody in business would make in 5 minutes, it'll take a museum 5 months to make with 1 million meetings. But really, you can't do that right now. Museums are tax exempt because they are supposed to be open for the public to enjoy, for the education of the public. So we'll see what happens. I started hearing, 3 or 4 months ago, right after the shutdown, from friends of mine who were curators who were saying, we don't expect to be open again until the fall. And I said, well, are you crazy? So that's where we are right now. Of course, I never imagined every museum would be closed. But what I've written about the last couple of articles, and I'll return to it maybe once or twice, is the response of museums to the George Floyd shooting, which for a week or so has tossed coronavirus off the front page of the paper. A lot of museums have issued very dangerous and unwarranted statements about systemic racism, institutional racism. And I'm concerned about that for a number of reasons. I think insofar as the George Floyd killing was concerned, which was terrible, and I watched the tape, it was gruesome. I can't think of anything that a museum director has to add to the question of police brutality. That is far away from their expertise. I think what happened in Minneapolis is not something that a museum director, say in Kansas City, which is what I wrote about in my last article. I wrote about the Nelson Atkins. I don't see why that fact situation compels the museum to feel that they have to apologize. Apologize for what? What happened in Minneapolis is something that really doesn't have anything to do with the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. And it just makes me uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. Museums seem very quick to extol Black Lives Matter, which is an organization. And I don't think they really know what they're endorsing. I don't think they did their homework. Having made all of this fuss over museums being closed, I felt compelled to visit one of the first museums to reopen, and that's why I'm going to the San Antonio Museum of Art tomorrow. I think it was the second museum that reopened in the country. The first was Houston, the MFA in Houston, and I'd been there in February, and I wrote 2 or 3 articles in the Houston MFA, which is a very nice museum, and I didn't feel compelled to go back to Houston. I haven't been to San Antonio for a while, so tomorrow I will go and see what they're doing, and I'll wear a face mask, and I'll check out their Purell dispensers, and I'll report back on what that experience was like. So those are my introductory comments, Jason. I'll turn it over to you.
Let's start. This is something I've always wondered. With all the looting and the rioting going on, what do institutions like the Met, are you privy to what are their contingency plans if a mob starts walking up the steps? Like, I imagine a U.S. Marine Corps unit might emerge from Central Park and quickly disperse all these people. But what do you think?
It might. It might. You don't know what their security plans are, but a place like the Met, the Frick, Seattle Art Museum is in the middle of it. They have all kinds of contingency plans for emergencies like that, and I think almost every city in the country has experienced since the 1960s some kind of violence, and whether it was the riots in the late 60s, the Rodney King riot in Los Angeles in '92. So they have a contingency plan. One of the reasons that museums often look like banks is that they are fortresses. I have to say, I know the security plan for the Addison, where I was director, and yes, if somebody tried to breach the Addison, the police would be over there in 2 minutes, and there's a plan notifying the fire department and all of those things. But I think the looting class, they're interested in Ferragamos and sneakers and electronics and stuff like that. I don't think they realize the billion dollar stuff is in the museums, but the museums are aware of that.
Why don't museums have just a flat entry fee? You know, the Met famously has suggested donations. We've done that at NRI for our virtual Burke to Buckley program, and we get a good response, but we're not, might get half the people. And I know with museums, it's probably far less. Like, if they're serious about not using endowment funds or art sales to fund operating expenses, why not just increase the revenue? Like, have some small fee, you'll probably still get larger donations. What do you think about that?
Well, it goes back to every museum being structured differently. There are many museums that, by their terms of trust, the documents that establish them, every museum has had a potentate who they consider the founder. They have in their founding documents that they have to be free. In which case they have to be free. And a number of museums have gotten around that. Okay, it's free to go into the permanent collection, but if there's an exhibition, a temporary exhibition, you have to pay $15 or $20. There are also museums okay, I'll use this as an example, the Clark, which is a very chic, very well-funded museum. They don't make a great deal of money from the admission charge. For museums in that position, and I think that's most museums, they charge admission in order to have the flip side of admission, which is a membership program. They'll charge admission, but they'll say to members who give $50 a year or $100 a year, okay, you give us your membership and then you'll get in 4 times for free. And so that's a way to attract those entry-level donors. Now you get a case like the Met. The Met, I think their visitorship last year was 7 million people. A lot of those are tourists. And they're paying $20 a head or $25, I can't remember what it is. That's real money. Now, the Met 3 or 4 years ago, they had to change their founding documents to charge admission. The Met technically, legally was free, but they went and they were able to change their founding documents to put in an admission fee. And I think they might be kicking themselves right now because they built their budget on an admission fee, a high tourist admission fee. And so now they're not getting that. That's why the Met almost immediately when COVID-19 happened, when the shutdown happened, they said, we're going to have $100 million deficit because they looked at that tourist income. But every museum functions differently. I would say the model for most museums is they really don't make a tremendous amount of money from admissions.
Our colleagues Stephanie Cates and Phoenix, when more museums are open again, do you see a resurgence in interest or even interest from new audiences since we've all been isolated and unable to enjoy the peaceful escape they provide?
I hope so. When the Houston Museum of Fine Arts opened, I guess they opened the 3rd week in May, and there was a line at the front door when the museum opened, and there were a lot of people who missed that contemplation. One of the things I love about Texas is the civic pride that people have in their museums, whether it's Fort Worth or San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, the sense of ownership that they have about works of great art that are in their cities and belong to them. And they take great comfort out of being able to go to the museum for an hour and they have favorites in the collection. So I hope they do, because if there's any time in my lifetime that we need an oasis, it's right now. And you have a great museum in Phoenix also, a nice museum in Phoenix.
She has a follow-up question. Have you seen any good examples of museums that have stepped up their digital game during this lockdown to reach new audiences, increase their online traffic?
Yes, that is a good question. Because I get all the emails from museums. Some have been very nimble, and some have been very primitive but very well-meaning. Some, like the Frick in New York, has they're doing a lectures/travelogue series that's pitched to a museum lover. They're not specialist lectures, and I think they're quite good. The MFA in Houston did a lot of good stuff also while it was closed. I don't think naturally museums are that well suited to that, because there's no substitute for the original work of art. And to me, and this is probably a very old-fashioned belief, a museum is a communal place. And there is something about going to a museum, walking up those steps into those gracious buildings, elegant buildings, the galleries, and just looking at a Renoir, looking at a Turner, looking at a Whistler, and just standing in front of it for as long as you want. And you can't duplicate that online. I don't think you can.
From Eric Noreen, who's in Colorado, though he lives in Seattle. I have been astounded by the compulsion by organization heads to pay obedience to woke progressive slogans, quote, the history of 400 years of institutional racism, etc. Locally, statements like this have been coming from symphony, art museum, church corporations. Do you have any explanation for this? Has the radical left won the rhetorical battle?
Well, that is a very good question, and it's a very rich question. I started getting them, these emails, and then they came from symphonies, they came from opera companies, theater companies. I mean, I got an email from Expedia, from Uber. I mean, why do they think I care about what their thinking is about racism in American history? They all sounded the same, and which was disturbing to me in and of itself, because arts people are supposed to be free spirits, and they're all saying the same thing. It's like they're all using the same crib sheet. I think a lot of museum directors and museum curators, chief curators, are really being pushed by the younger staff. There's a real generational dynamic at places like the Whitney, and I thought it was the Whitney, MoMA. I thought it was a New York thing, but no, I think it's a national thing. The younger woke staff in museums are saying, they're going to their directors and they're saying, well, why don't you take a stand on this? Now, when I was a museum director, my response would have been, hey, young person, it's none of your business. But I think in the last 5-10 years, that has become unpalatable. And I think it varies from museum to museum. There are some directors, like there are a handful probably of university presidents, college presidents, who will say, hey, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. And we're an arts organization. We're not a social service organization. But many of them won't do that. They're afraid to do it. And I never believe that we've lost the battle. I think this let's hope this misplaced rage will burn itself out. Because I think museums that push this, the art museums that push this this discourse, it has nothing to do with art, and that's their mission. And they'll find after a while that it's going to be the tank will be empty of gas in terms of how far they can get on with it.
In light of the Black Lives Matter movement, are museums receiving pressure to diversify their boards and/or the artists they feature?
Sure, that's been going on for a long time. And I've seen it develop really from the time that I was a young curator. And I think that I have many feelings about this. I think that the selection of trustees is a very delicate, very fraught issue, because the trustees, when you're made a trustee, you're made a co-owner of the place. You've got fiduciary responsibility, you have decisions on spending money, how the property is used. You are the owner of it for the time that you're a trustee. And I think that the biggest consideration for being a trustee should be passion for the institution. And I say that having seen many trustees, having watched many trustees who have no passion for the institution. But the second thing, and it's really entwined, is the financial commitment to an institution. Those two things are vital to a functional organization. When the state or the city, in the case of New York, City of New York, tries to tell a museum, well, your priority can't be those two things intertwined. There's a third thing, and that is diversification. That is a quota system of trustees. That undermines the health of the institution. I think that I have no problem with the different voices at the table. That's fine. But they have to have that kind of commitment, and they have to have that financial commitment to the museum. You can't play tokenism with a museum board, because their work is so central. Yes, that's been going on for a while. I think there are a number of museums, and I worked in two museums that I will just completely say that this was the case. There was an old boys network, and I'm delighted to see that those are few and far between now. It rankled me to know that a colleague of mine, another curator, was making a lot less money than I made because she was a woman. Or she wasn't getting the promotions as often as the men got because she was a woman. That was a real factor in museums. And it's a question of basic fairness, really. So museums have been getting that pressure for a while. And I think they'll continue to get the pressure to diversify their ranks of curators, but I'm against that, because it so often becomes tokenism and quotas, and nobody is well served by that.
Katie Bubelis wants to know what percentage of museum budgets come from local public entities like museum districts or city budgets?
From like cities and towns, is that what?
Yeah.
Well, again, there are a group of museums, and this is one of the great joys about American museum system. No group of museums is organized the same way. There's so much variation. The European museum system is almost entirely state-owned, government-owned. In the case of France, all the museums are owned by the state, and that has been true since the 19th century. So you get the museums are basically bureaucracies. Here, there are so many different models. There are a number of museums, like the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the museum system in San Francisco, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, that they belong to the state or the county. So if I work for LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, I'm a county employee, and the county gives LACMA most of its money. So they are state or local agencies. In the case of New York, you have another model where the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Brooklyn Museum, yes, they're private museums, but they sit on city land. The city owns the land. And the city Arts Commission and the State Arts Commission, they give the museums in New York real money. And of course, with money, all money from government is political money at the end of the day. And in the case of New York, the political money is going in the direction now, New York City, okay, you have to diversify your boards and your staff while you're at it, or you won't get that $1 million that you've been used to getting every year. Every state in the country has a state arts agency that gets money from the National Endowment for the Arts, according to its population. And but it's not a great deal of money. In the case of Vermont, where I live, Vermont gets from the NEA something like $700,000 a year to distribute to arts organizations. So it varies.
What would New York State get from the NEA? I mean, would the
New York
Met
State
ever receive NEA money?
New York gets a lot of money. I did a story for National Review, I think it was a couple of months ago, on where the NEA's money goes to. And I took 2 or 3 of their funding cycles. Surprise! Who gets a lot of NEA money? The District of Columbia. Museums in the District of Columbia get a boatload of money. The District of Columbia is where the NEA staff lives. They got more money than the whole state of Illinois and Ohio and Michigan, Texas. They did really well. And New York City did really well too. And so did Los Angeles did really well. And I know that these 3 places have a lot of arts organizations, but the District of Columbia made out like a bandit. And in the case of New York City, and I've written about this for NR a number of times, New York City, Manhattan arts organizations, they have a built-in donor base. There are millionaires and gazillionaires in Manhattan that you don't have in a place like Kansas City. Yeah, there are a lot of rich people in Kansas City, but you don't have the same built-in donor base. And my feeling has been, okay, if you're a museum and you're in Fairfield County or in Connecticut or Westchester County in New York, you got a lot of donors that a museum in Milwaukee Art Museum, which is a very fine museum. Your museum in Seattle, Jason, is a very fine museum. The donor bases in those places are limited. Yes, there are a lot of rich people in Seattle, but there are a lot of hospitals that are raising money, and theater groups and museums are raising money, schools. And I think for the NEA, they have to take that into account. I made a fuss in 2 or 3 National Review articles about the amount of money they give to the Public Theater in New York. It's their biggest theater recipient. And the Public Theater's got a national brand. They could raise money nationally. I knew about the Public Theater when I was a teenager. They did Shakespeare in the Park. And I lived in this little town in Connecticut, and I knew about them. So they have a national brand. The Met has a national brand. The Frick has a national brand. And they have a lot of donors they can go to for money.
Last question. Are people trading art online? When do you foresee auctions reopening?
Oh, they've been open. They've been open, and I'm going to write about that in a couple of weeks. I've been keeping an eye on online. The auctions, they're very entrepreneurial. They're businesses. They have to make money. And when the auction business closed, they were the quickest to go online, and I think they have been preparing for it. Christie's and Sotheby's have been doing low-end online auctions for the last 2 or 3 years. But now, the last couple of months, they jumped into the auction business online, and they are making money. I don't approve of it, because I don't think you should buy something without seeing it, a work of art at least. But I have to tell you, I have told people a million times over the years, don't buy something at an auction unless you've seen it. But a month ago, I bought something at an auction that I did not see. And I knew exactly what it was. But that's because I'm an art historian. A lot of people, they don't have that experience. But yeah, they're making money from it.
Actually, we're going to take one more question. This is from Tom Lawrenson. Very specific.
Hi, Tom.
On the federal level, do you feel that the Institute of Museum and Library Services plays a viable role on a contemporary basis?
Yes, they do. I wrote a story a few weeks ago about IMLS for National Review. Of the 3, IMLS, National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, I have no question that IMLS does great work. They fund a lot of stuff that is not glitzy, but needs to be done. They're giving money to a lot of libraries, archives that aren't going out there and with their tin cup and raising money. They're not doing it. There are a lot of African American small museums and libraries that they just don't have a donor base. And IMLS is doing very, very good work, not only with the African American and with small libraries, but also museum conservation, which is very difficult to fund. It's not like you're going into a gallery and you're seeing, oh, there is my name up in lights in a gallery. When you give money to conserve a painting, your name is not up in lights. So raising money for that is hard. But the IMLS does superb work, quiet work. One of the reasons is the big part of the thrust for IMLS is libraries. And librarians, and I've been on a lot of library boards, they don't realize that they're the best fundraisers in the world because they are sincere. And they're knowledgeable, and they just hate to ask people for money. But the cause is very good. Their work is good too.
Great. With that, we're going to end today's call. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, everyone, for your support. If you haven't received our mid-year newsletter, which will explain everything we've been doing in this virtual world we've been living in, please let us know. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. Delighted.
And again, everyone, hopefully you can join us tomorrow at noon Eastern for the call with Kyle Smith and Kevin Williamson. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Jason.